Trump is not your father." The words did not come as a whisper, nor as a measured reply. They landed like a thunderclap, echoing across the polished walls of the studio, silencing the hum of cameras and the faint shuffle of the audience. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Even the bright stage lights flickered as if startled by the audacity. But the sting of those words wasn't born from Jasmine's mouth. It was Barron who launched them, his voice dripping with arrogance. His tone sharpened with the entitlement of a dynasty that had always mistaken power for permanence. He leaned forward, chin lifted, smirk tugging at the edge of his lips as though he had just delivered the final blow. The audience gasped. Some chuckled nervously. Others shifted in their seats, unsure if what they had just heard was arrogance disguised as humor or cruelty laid bare. Cameras zoomed in. The nation watched, millions of eyes glued to screens from New York apartments to Texas diners, from dorm rooms in California to immigrant households where children sat cross-legged, wide-eyed, waiting to see what would happen next. Jasmine didn't move at first. She didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes, didn't rush to fill the silence Barron left hanging in the air like a guillotine waiting to drop. She simply sat there, the faintest smile playing on her lips, as though she'd heard variations of this insult her entire life and had long since learned how to carry them without letting them weigh her. Down, Barron mistook the silence for victory. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing, soaking in the moment as if he had just rewritten the rules of debate on live television. To him, this wasn't an exchange of ideas. It was a coronation of arrogance, a chance to assert that legacy was louder than truth, that his father's shadow stretched so far it could eclipse anyone who dared stand in it. But arrogance always overplays its hand. In the audience, a murmur began to spread. Not everyone was laughing. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to their neighbors, "Did he really just say that?" Social media was already ablaze, phones lighting up with frantic typing. He actually said it. On live TV, he said, "Trump is not your father." The moderators froze, their scripts suddenly useless. Producers backstage gestured wildly, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let the drama play out. But the cameras never blinked. They stayed locked on Jasmine's face, waiting for the response. And in that face, there was no sign of collapse, no hint of insecurity. Instead, her expression carried the weight of every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every woman who had been asked to prove herself twice over, every child who had been mocked for daring to dream outside the lines of dynasty. Her stillness was power. Her silence was a fuse. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. Viewers leaned forward on couches across America. Even Barron's smirk wavered just slightly, as if some instinct whispered that he had poked at something far larger than he could comprehend. Then at last, Jasmine inhaled. One breath, steady, grounded, purposeful. She lifted her chin. Eyes locked not on Barron, but on the audience, the studio audience, the television audience, the unseen millions who knew what it meant to be underestimated. The faint smile remained, but behind it was fire, because what came next would not simply be a rebuttal. It would not be a retort for the sake of scoring points. It would be a revelation. A counterstrike that reached beyond one young man's arrogance and touched the heart of a nation's struggle. With legacy and belonging, and when she finally spoke, her voice would flip the room and Barron's world upside down. Asterisk, the insult hung in the air, still reverberating long after Barron's smirk had faded into the glow of the studio lights. What made this moment different from the countless heated debates America had seen before was not just the audacity of the attack, but the stage on which it unfolded. This wasn't some late-night talk show or a partisan rally. This was national television, a primetime event carried live, with millions of Americans watching from every corner of the country. The cameras weren't just recording a spat. They were documenting a cultural reckoning. For Barron, this was supposed to be easy. He had arrived with the swagger of someone born into a dynasty, convinced that his father's name was more powerful than any argument he could make. In his mind, the Trump legacy was untouchable, a shield against criticism, a crown inherited rather than earned. And tonight, he wielded that name not as a burden, but as a weapon. Every word out of his mouth was laced with the assumption that lineage equaled legitimacy, that being a Trump was itself a qualification, a destiny. But Jasmine Crockett represented the opposite pole of America's story. She hadn't inherited power. She had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. Her name didn't open doors, it forced her to break them down. She wasn't on that stage because of bloodlines or family wealth. She was there because she had clawed her way into the conversation with intellect, grit, and an unshakable sense of purpose. She embodied a different kind of American inheritance, one rooted in dignity, sacrifice, and the unrelenting belief that truth can topple even the most gilded dynasty. This was why the stakes were so high. To the millions watching at home, this wasn't just a clash between two individuals. It was a symbolic battle for America's soul, a contest between legacy and merit, between inherited arrogance and earned dignity. Viewers weren't simply asking, who's winning this debate? They were asking themselves, who really gets to define what it means to be American? In immigrant households, parents watched with clenched jaws, remembering every time they had been told they didn't belong. In college dorms, students streamed the debate on laptops, swapping memes and outrage in real time. In diners across the Midwest, workers sipping late-night coffee shook their heads, some muttering about arrogance, others about courage. Social media lit up like a wildfire. Hashtags collided and multiplied. Clips of Barron's smirk and Jasmine's silence looping endlessly with captions that split the country down the ends. Well, the moderators sensed it too. They knew this wasn't simply political theater. This was a defining cultural moment. One where the audience wasn't just observing, they were participating. Every tweet, every share, every heated conversation sparked in living rooms and group chats was adding fuel to a fire that was spreading. It's faster than the cameras could capture. Barron sat tall, mistaking the noise for momentum. He believed that repeating his father's shadow was enough to secure dominance. But arrogance is blind to its own fragility. He couldn't see that his very strategy, leaning on legacy, was the weakest shield against someone like Jasmine. She wasn't rattled by dynasty, she was sharpened by it. Every condescending smirk only fed her resolve. Every arrogant word only gave her more ground to stand on, and for those watching at home, the symbolism cut deep. If Barron could use his father's name to belittle a woman who had fought her way into the halls of power, then what did that say about everyone else who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or mocked for daring to exist outside the safety net of privilege? What did it say to every immigrant child told their dreams were too big? Every worker told they'd never rise above their station? Every woman told to know her place? The studio air grew thicker, charged with the awareness that this was no longer a debate but a test of whether arrogance could still define identity, or whether dignity could finally take the microphone and refuse to let go. And Jasmine knew it. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her shoulders, not as a burden, but as fuel. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for millions who had been told in ways subtle and blunt that they didn't belong. She was speaking for a nation tired of watching entitlement masquerade as leadership. The silence stretched, then snapped as she leaned forward. Barron's smirk faltered just enough for cameras to catch it, the mask slipping for the briefest second. And in that flicker, the audience at home saw not a confident heir, but a boy clinging to a borrowed throne. The next exchange wasn't just a comeback, it was a public unmasking. Asterisk. Barron Trump's presence on that stage was not an accident of scheduling or a quirk of television programming. It was the culmination of years of grooming, being told and retold a story that power was his inheritance, not something to be earned. From the moment he could understand words, he was wrapped in the mythology of dynasty, the idea that the Trump name itself was a fortress, a weapon, and a destiny all at once. In the gilded hallways of his upbringing, he was not just a son. He was a symbol, a living extension of a legacy that demanded obedience from others and deference from the world. Every nod of respect he received, every door that opened without effort, every microphone placed before him was not because of merit, but because of blood. And like water soaking into dry earth, Barron absorbed the lesson. He deserved the platform simply because he was a Trump. This entitlement became second nature. While other children learned humility through scraped knees and awkward failures, Barron's mistakes were softened by wealth, hidden by influence, or reframed as brilliance by sycophants, eager to please his father. Teachers who might have corrected him hesitated. Reporters who might have criticized him softened their tone. He grew up in an environment where applause was automatic, and silence from others was interpreted not as disapproval, but as awe by the time he stepped onto the national stage. Barron had internalized the belief that his words carried weight by default. He didn't have to earn respect. He only had to invoke his lineage. His confidence was not forged in the fires of struggle, but inflated like a balloon. Large and impressive from a distance, yet fragile and thin beneath the surface. On that debate night, this fragility was hidden behind a practiced swagger. He sat tall, smirked often, punctuated his sentences with the cadence of someone who thought the audience existed to validate him. Each insult he hurled was not crafted from wit, but borrowed from the arsenal of arrogance his father had modeled for decades. He thought the family name was a shield that could withstand any attack, that the Trump brand was indestructible, but arrogance is a poor disguise for inexperience. When the spotlight lingered too long, when silence demanded more than a sneer, Barron faltered. His eyes darted for validation, searching the crowd for laughter that didn't always come, for applause that sometimes stalled. He had been told his entire life that dominance was his birthright, but no one had prepared him for what happens when that birthright is questioned, or worse, stripped bare. Still, in his own mind, he was untouchable. He believed the very stage he stood on owed him reverence. Why? Because he carried his father's last name. To him, that was the only credential that mattered. He didn't just feel entitled to the microphone. He felt entitled to define reality itself. Identity, legitimacy, belonging. These were not concepts to be debated. They were decrees he could issue. If he said someone wasn't worthy, that was supposed to be the end of the conversation. This sense of entitlement reached beyond words. It was in his posture, the way he leaned back in his chair as though debates were coronations. It was in the way he gestured toward Jasmine with dismissive flicks of his hand, as though she were a minor obstacle rather than a formidable opponent. It was in the way he looked past moderators, past the audience, as if the entire nation were just a mirror reflecting back his own importance. And yet beneath all of that posturing, there was a quiet fragility. His hands fidgeted when the cameras weren't tight on his face. His smile cracked just a second too early, revealing nerves he worked desperately to hide. He had never truly faced consequences for his words. He had never truly been challenged by someone who could withstand the bluster and fire back with precision. He had never been forced to confront what happens when the balloon of arrogance finally bursts. The irony of Barron's position was cruel. The very privilege that gave him the confidence to step onto that stage was the same privilege that left him unprepared to survive it. He had been shielded for so long that he mistook protection for power. He confused access with strength, inheritance with identity. In the Trump household, fragility was repackaged as dominance, and arrogance was rewarded as courage. But in the arena of live television, under the glare of millions of eyes, there was no shelter big enough to hide the cracks as he spoke. As he taunted, as he leaned on his father's shadow, he didn't realize the trap he was building for himself. Every insult framed him not as strong, but as dependent. Every smirk exposed not confidence, but insecurity. And every word that invoked the Trump name dug him deeper into the pit of dynasty politics that Jasmine was about to dismantle. Because audiences can forgive inexperience. They can even forgive arrogance when paired with authenticity. But what they will not forgive is entitlement that masquerades as leadership. Viewers at home weren't just hearing Barron's words. They were recognizing the echoes of every boss who had dismissed them, every gatekeeper who had shut them out, every entitled heir who had climbed on the backs of others while pretending it was merit. He wasn't simply a young man on stage. He was a mirror of the very system so many Americans had grown weary of. And while Barron thought he was controlling the narrative, the reality was slipping from his grasp. The more he leaned on dynasty, the more the audience saw weakness. The more he mocked Jasmine, the more they recognized resilience in her silence. The more he claimed superiority, the more obvious it became that superiority was all he had ever known, and therefore all he could ever rely on. He believed arrogance was armor. But armor can be heavy, and in Barron's case, it was hollow. Beneath the shine of dynasty, there was no foundation. Only a boy struggling to live up to a name he didn't fully understand, carrying arrogance like a sword, but no wisdom to wield it. And that is why this night, this stage, this very confrontation carried a weight he could not anticipate. Because when arrogance meets truth, the fall is always spectacular. Asterisk long before she sat under the bright lights of that stage, Jasmine Crockett had been fighting battles no camera ever captured. Her journey did not begin with applause or with the comfort of a famous last name. It began in rooms where she was underestimated, in conversations where her voice was talked over, in courtrooms where her presence was met with skepticism. And every time she was told she didn't belong, she stayed. Every time she was dismissed, she spoke louder. Every time someone tried to silence her, she'd learned how to turn that silence into strength. Her path through the law was never smooth. While others leaned on connections, Jasmine leaned on resilience. She studied late, worked harder, prepared longer. The odds were never tilted in her favor. But she became a lawyer because she believed the law could be more than a system of power. It could be a tool for justice. She defended clients who couldn't afford hope, took cases that others rejected, stood beside those who had been written off. In every courtroom, she carried the weight of people who looked like her, who lived like her, who had been told their voices didn't matter. Asterisk that fire for justice carried her into public service, where the stage only grew larger and the opposition only grew louder. In hearings and debates, she found herself facing the same kind of arrogance that Barron carried to that television stage. Men who believed power was theirs by birthright. Colleagues who smirked when she spoke. Officials who rolled their eyes when she pressed too hard. They questioned her identity, her legitimacy, her place at the table, and still she stayed. Still, she spoke. Still, she built a reputation not for bowing to arrogance, but for dismantling it with precision and courage. What America saw in Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a politician or a lawyer. They saw a fighter forged by resistance. She had lived the struggle of being told she was too loud, too bold, too different. She had been told to sit down, to wait her turn, to defer to dynasty. And every time, she refused. Asterisk, it was this history, this lived experience, that made her so dangerous to someone like Barron. His arrogance assumed silence. His insults assumed insecurity. But Jasmine had walked through storms far worse than the condescension of a young heir. She had been underestimated before, and she had turned that underestimation into her sharpest weapon. Viewers who knew her story felt it in their bones as they watched. Immigrants saw in her the echo of their own parents, who had been told their accents made them lesser. Women saw in her the reflection of their own battles in boardrooms, where their ideas were stolen and repackaged by men with louder voices. Young people saw in her the possibility that you didn't need a dynasty to define you. You could define yourself. Asterisk. Her story was not one of privilege, but of persistence. And persistence builds a kind of strength dynasty can never touch. It builds a calm that arrogance cannot rattle, a confidence that cannot be faked, a dignity that cannot be bought. Asterisk. That's why when Barron sneered, when he leaned on his father's name as though it were a weapon, Jasmine didn't flinch. She had been here before, in 1,000 different forms. She had faced judges who thought she was too young, colleagues who thought she was too bold, systems that thought she was too powerless. And in every case, she learned how to flip the narrative, how to turn someone else's arrogance into her own platform for truth. She carried those lessons into that studio. Every word Barron spoke reminded her of those old battles. Every smirk a familiar echo of people who thought she wouldn't last. And that's why she smiled. Not because she was amused, but because she recognized the pattern. She knew exactly what came next. The audience watching didn't just see a politician preparing to reply. They saw history condensing into a single moment, years of struggle, of silencing, of dismissal, crystallizing into the calm before the strike. They saw the stillness of someone who had learned that power is not in how loud you speak, but in how deeply your words land. For Barron, this was a game. For Jasmine, this was life. And life had taught her something arrogance could never teach: patience. She understood that silence was not weakness, but strategy. That letting arrogance dig its own grave was sometimes the most powerful move you could make. And so she waited, steady, calm, unshaken. In that waiting, the audience felt the gravity of her story. They felt the weight of her persistence pressing against the fragility of Barron's entitlement. They leaned forward, not just to see if she would respond, but to witness how history arms those who have been underestimated. And that is why the insult did not pierce her. It sharpened her. It reminded her of every courtroom where she stood her ground, every hearing where she turned mockery into momentum, every debate where she transformed dismissal into dominance. Jasmine Crockett was not new to this. She had been preparing her entire life for this moment, for this insult, for this exact kind of opponent. And in this moment, all of that history became her sharpest weapon. The insult should have been enough. A single sharp jab meant to sting, to destabilize. But Barron Trump wasn't satisfied with a single strike. The arrogance in his tone, the smirk on his face, carried the weight of entitlement that had never once been checked. He doubled down, repeating the taunt in slightly different words, testing its impact, circling his target like a child with a stick poking at something he didn't understand. "Come on," he sneered, his voice rising with each repetition. "Everyone's wondering it. Who is he to you? Your father? Your husband?" The words echoed, bouncing awkwardly through the air. Gaining no wit or cleverness with each repetition, only a deeper sense of cruelty. Some in the crowd gasped audibly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Commentators leaned forward, whispering into their microphones, sensing the volatility of the moment. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, shoulders squared, eyes forward. There was a kind of serenity about her that felt almost cinematic, the calm before a storm. The silence that makes thunder inevitable. She did not snap back. She did not roll her eyes. She did not match insult with insult. Instead, she let the weight of his words hang in the air, as though she was giving him space to reveal his own emptiness. It was a restraint that only years of battle could teach. Lesser debaters would have lunged at the bait, firing back with something equally sharp, escalating the spectacle into chaos. But Jasmine had lived her entire career knowing that the power of her voice lay not in its volume, but in its precision. Every word she spoke carried intent, and in this moment, her silence became louder than any insult Barron could hurl. The audience began to murmur. Some were restless, eager for her reply. Others were struck by the dignity of her composure. The commentators leaned even closer, their voices hushed but urgent. "She's holding," one whispered. "She's waiting," another replied. "She's letting him fall into his own trap," a third murmured, almost in awe. Barron mistook that silence for weakness. Like arrogance always does, he interpreted composure as hesitation. His smirk grew wider. He leaned closer to his microphone, his voice dripping with a condescension so thick it practically oozed into the room. "Nothing to say, huh?" he taunted, drawing out the words. "I guess I struck a nerve. Or maybe..." He paused for effect, glancing around the stage with the confidence of someone who believed the crowd belonged to him. "Maybe silence means I'm right." The crowd murmured louder now, a low rumble that moved like a current across the room. Commentators began speculating in real time. "She looks calm, but is she cornered? Barron is pushing harder, but is it working or backfiring? This is dangerous if she doesn't reply soon. The moment could slip away." But Jasmine Crockett was not worried. To her, this was not chaos. It was choreography. Every word Barron repeated, every smirk he flashed, was another brick in the wall he was building around himself. And she knew that when the moment came, she would not need to swing wildly. She would only need to knock out one brick, and the entire wall would collapse. Her composure was its own weapon. Her measured breaths, her still hands, her unwavering gaze, all of it told the audience that she was in control, even if Barron couldn't see it. She radiated a kind of unshakable dignity that stood in stark contrast to his erratic, juvenile jabs. Tension built with every second of silence. The room felt heavier. The commentators spoke faster. The cameras zoomed closer. Barron repeated the insult yet again, this time louder. This time leaning so far into the microphone that it squealed with feedback. And still, Jasmine Crockett waited for the audience. It felt like time itself slowed. They were not just watching a debate. They were watching a duel of philosophies. On one side, arrogance, repetition, and empty spectacle. On the other, restraint, dignity, and the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived much worse. Some in the crowd began to shift in their loyalty. Where a few minutes earlier, they may have laughed at Barron's audacity. Now his persistence looked desperate, even childish. Jasmine's calmness reframed the entire exchange, making him smaller, her larger. The commentators sensed it too. She hasn't said a word. And yet somehow she's already winning this moment. One remarked, but the air was thick, charged, expectant. Everyone in the room and everyone watching at home knew the silence could not last forever. At some point, Jasmine would have to speak. And when she did, the weight of that first sentence would decide the fate of the entire exchange. The crowd leaned in, breaths held. Even Barron, arrogant as ever, seemed to sense that the silence was no longer his ally. He fumbled for another repetition, one more insult to throw into the void. But it came out weaker this time, less sharp. It's almost defensive, and that was when it happened. Jasmine inhaled slowly, one calm, steady breath. Her shoulders lifted slightly, then settled. She raised her chin just enough to meet his gaze directly, and with that single movement, the entire battlefield shifted. The crowd hushed instantly, as though some invisible signal had passed through the room. The commentators stopped mid-sentence. Even Barron froze for a split second, as if some instinct inside him recognized the danger, because everyone knew. The silence was ending. Her weapon was ready. Her history was about to speak then. With one calm breath, Jasmine shifted the entire battlefield. Asterisk, the silence was unbearable. A silence so sharp it cut through the bright studio lights and pressed down on every chest in the audience. Barron's smirk still hung awkwardly on his face, as if frozen mid-performance, waiting for the laugh that never came. He had repeated his insult so many times, it had lost all shape, all bite. And then finally, Jasmine Crockett moved. She didn't rush. She didn't lunge. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned into the microphone with a composure that carried more weight than any shout could. A small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Her eyes locked directly on Barron's, piercing through the veneer of swagger he had wrapped around himself like armor. She let the pause stretch just long enough for every heart in the room to pound faster, for every camera to tighten its focus, for every viewer at home to hold their breath. And then she spoke, "Trump is not your father." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a split second, the studio froze. The audience didn't know how to react. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was electric. It was the kind of silence that precedes an eruption. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Commentators in the booth grabbed at their microphones, unsure if they should speak or just let the moment breathe. Barron blinked, his smirk faltering, confusion flashing across his face before the meaning of the words sank in. Because everyone in that room understood it immediately. This wasn't just a jab. It wasn't just a retort. It was a dismantling, both literal and symbolic. Asterisk on the surface. It was a surgical counterpunch to his taunt about Jasmine's lineage and belonging. He had tried to mock her identity by tying it to his father, by weaponizing the Trump name as though it were a crown to be inherited. But in a single line, Jasmine cut that crown to pieces. By saying Trump is not your father, she stripped away the illusion that dynasty gave him legitimacy, reminding everyone that identity cannot be borrowed, cannot be handed down, cannot be weaponized against those who earn their place. Asterisk. But underneath the literal clapback lay something even sharper, a symbolic dethroning of dynasty itself. It was not just Barron she was addressing. It was the entire Trump legacy. With those words, she told America that bloodlines do not make leaders. Entitlement does not make authority, and a last name does not make truth. She shattered the myth of inherited power in one sentence. And the weight of that revelation crashed over the room like a tidal wave. The crowd couldn't hold back anymore. Gasps turned to murmurs. Murmurs turned to shouts. And then, like a dam breaking, applause and cheers erupted from the audience. Some rose to their feet, clapping furiously, shaking their heads in disbelief at the precision of the blow they had just witnessed. The cameras cut to Barron. His face was flushed, crimson spreading across his cheeks. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came out. His swagger had collapsed under the weight of silence, his confidence exposed as fragile theater. He tried to smirk again, but it twitched awkwardly, breaking into something closer to panic. For the first time that night, he looked not like the heir to a dynasty, but like a boy in over his head. Realizing too late that the stage he had tried to dominate was not his to own, and the audience saw it. They felt it. This was no longer a debate. This was an unmasking. Commentators scrambled to capture the moment in words. Did she just... She turned his insult inside out. That wasn't just a comeback. That was a declaration. On screens across the country, reactions exploded instantly. Tweets flashed like wildfire, hashtags forming within minutes. Trump is not your father. Hashtag Crockett vs. Barron. That line will be remembered for years. A dynasty undone in 6 words. I screamed when she said it. Instant classic. Clips began circulating within seconds. Slowed down replays of Jasmine's smirk before delivering the line. Supercuts of the crowd's gasps. Reaction videos already forming from viewers at home. Some users added dramatic sound effects. The record scratch paused before the line, the air horns when the crowd erupted. Others froze the shot on Barron's stunned face, captioning it with the words, "When you realize arrogance doesn't equal power." But in the studio, the moment was still unfolding. Jasmine didn't revel in the applause. She didn't gesture to the crowd or gloat in victory. She simply sat back in her chair, composed, her eyes still on Barron, as if daring him to try again. Her calmness only amplified the magnitude of what had just happened. She had delivered a mic drop so devastating it didn't need a follow-up. And yet, the brilliance of her restraint made the anticipation even sharper, because the audience sensed something more. They felt it in the cadence of her voice, in the way she had left just enough space after the line. She wasn't done. Barron, flustered, tried to speak. His voice cracked slightly as he stumbled into the microphone. That's not you don't even, but the crowd's reaction drowned him out. The cheers and applause rising in volume until his words dissolved into the noise. He looked small now, swallowed by the sound of a public rejecting his entitlement in real time. Jasmine allowed the crowd its eruption, but only for a moment. Then she leaned forward again, her smirk returning, her voice steady and measured, and the entire studio hushed once more instinctively. Because everyone knew she wasn't finished. The first line had been the dagger. Whatever came next would be the twist. And just when viewers thought the moment was over, Jasmine pressed further. Asterisk the moment Jasmine Crockett uttered those 6 words. Trump is not your father, the studio erupted. But what happened next rippled far beyond those 4 walls. It wasn't just a line in a debate anymore. It was a cultural spark that ignited across America within seconds. Social media caught fire. On Twitter, hashtags surged almost instantly, climbing to the top of trending lists. Hashtag not your father, hashtag Crockett crush, hashtag dynasty down. Screens everywhere lit up with replays. The clip of Jasmine's smirk, the pause, and then the devastating line was replayed millions of times within the first hour. TikTok teens remixed it into dance challenges, adding bass drops right at the moment of her mic drop. Instagram Reels looped the line with captions like, "When the boss thinks their name makes them untouchable," paired with reaction shots of exploding fireworks. The meme factory worked overtime. One viral image showed Barron's stunned face frozen mid-reaction with the caption, "System error. Arrogance.exe has stopped responding." Another placed Jasmine in the center of a movie poster. Styled as an action heroine with the tagline, "She ended a dynasty with one line." But it wasn't just internet humor fueling the blaze, serious voices weighed in. Commentators across the political spectrum couldn't ignore what they had just witnessed. On progressive outlets, anchors called it the most iconic takedown of entitlement in modern debate history. Even centrist commentators admitted this was more than a clapback. It was a symbolic dismantling of dynasty politics in America. Celebrities chimed in. Kerry Washington tweeted, "A queen move. Respect. Hashtag not your father." Double quotes, LeBron James reposted the clip with fire emojis, writing, "That's how you shut arrogance down." Even musicians remixed the moment within 24 hours. A DJ had released a track sampling Jasmine's line over a pulsing beat, already trending on SoundCloud in immigrant households. Parents who had once been told they didn't belong smiled knowingly, replaying the clip for their children. "See," they said, "that's what standing your ground looks like." In classrooms, students shared the meme-laden video between classes, laughing but also nodding because they knew the weight behind the humor. This wasn't just about Barron. It was about every time someone had been told their worth came second to someone else's last name. Newsrooms scrambled to keep up with the tidal wave. Articles carried bold headlines. Crockett flips dynasty politics on its head, and 6 words that shook America. Op-eds poured in, dissecting why the line cut so deep. Analysts explained how the phrase both mocked Barron's insult and symbolically toppled the illusion that the Trump dynasty was unassailable. And for Barron, the aftermath was brutal. Every attempt he made to spin the exchange fell flat. When he tried to appear on friendly networks to explain himself, clips of his flustered expression kept being replayed side by side. His words couldn't compete with the image burned into the public consciousness, the air, undone by a single sentence. For Jasmine, the ripple effect was nothing short of seismic. Overnight, she became not just a congresswoman, but a symbol. Commentators framed her as the face of dignity standing up to arrogance, merit outshining entitlement. Protest signs appeared at rallies within days carrying her line in bold print. "Trump is not your father." Young activists painted murals of Jasmine's face with captions about resilience and truth. But the most powerful part of the aftermath wasn't the noise. It was the meaning people attached to it. Across the country, ordinary Americans turned the moment into something larger than politics. They saw it as a rebuke of every system that told them they weren't enough without the right connections, the right background, the right lineage. Jasmine's words became shorthand for a universal struggle. Dignity versus dynasty, truth versus arrogance, merit versus entitlement. Even international outlets picked up the story. In London, a BBC anchor remarked, "It wasn't just a jab. It was a message that resonates far beyond American borders. That democracy belongs to those who earn trust, not those who inherit a name." Clips kept spreading, layered with commentary, reaction shots, and hashtags. Some edits showed a timeline of American history, leading up to the moment, from civil rights marches to immigrant rallies, framing Jasmine's line as the latest in a long tradition of voices demanding recognition in cafes, barbershops, dorm rooms, workplaces. People debated the meaning. Some laughed at the humor. Some cheered at the symbolism. Some admitted with a touch of awe that they'd never seen someone dismantle entitlement so swiftly, so cleanly. And on such a massive stage, it was no longer just Barron's humiliation. It was America's reckoning. A reminder that dynasties crumble not when people shout louder, but when truth is delivered with composure and courage. And yet Jasmine herself didn't bask in the virality. She didn't tweet gloating remarks. She didn't appear in celebratory videos. She stayed composed, as if to say, the moment speaks for itself. And that restraint only made the movement grow stronger. People projected onto her the dignity of someone who understood that this was never about personal victory. It was about dismantling an idea that power is inherited, rather than earned. Still, one question lingered in the minds of millions who had witnessed the exchange. Would Jasmine stop at the mic drop? Would she let the line stand alone as the defining blow? Or would she seize the momentum to build something even greater? Because as iconic as the clapback was, There was something more powerful waiting just beyond the roar of applause. But Jasmine didn't leave it there. She turned. Humiliation into inspiration. The applause lingered like a storm refusing to fade, rolling in waves across the studio. But Jasmine didn't raise her hands in triumph, didn't lean back as if she'd already won. She waited. She let the roar die down until the room was once again quiet. Not heavy this time, but reverent. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably clear. "You see," she said, her gaze sweeping beyond Barron, beyond the cameras. As if speaking directly into the homes of millions, dignity isn't inherited. It's earned. The room stilled. It wasn't just a rebuttal anymore. It was a redefinition. The insult Barron had thrown meant to reduce. Jasmine's identity to a punchline was now transformed into a universal truth. Where he had tried to belittle, she lifted. Where he had tried to mock, she dignified. America, she continued, does not belong to those who think they own it. It belongs to those who serve it. To those who work, who struggle, who sacrifice. To those who believe that freedom is bigger than one last name. The crowd leaned in, transfixed. Commentators who had once scribbled notes now sat silently. Knowing they were witnessing more than a debate, they were witnessing a declaration. "This country," Jasmine said. Her words, firm yet calm, was not built by dynasties. It was built by dreamers, by people who had nothing but gave everything, by those who were told they didn't belong, who proved every single day that they did. Her eyes flicked back toward Barron, who now sat slumped in his chair, his earlier arrogance dissolved into silence. He looked smaller somehow, as though the bright lights no longer framed him as heir apparent, but as a shadow of something fading. The contrast was stark. Jasmine's presence filled the stage with dignity, while Barron seemed to shrink into irrelevance. "And so when you say someone didn't enough because they don't share your name," she said, her voice softening, "what you're really saying is that you've forgotten what America stands for. Because America's greatness has never been about inheritance. It has always been about courage." The audience erupted again, not with laughter this time, not even with shock, but with something deeper, affirmation. Applause rose, mixed with cheers and even tears from those who knew exactly what she meant, who felt in their bones the truth she had just laid bare. On screens across the country, families nodded. Young students tweeted, "This is the America we believe in." Veterans posted, "She's right. Service, not dynasty, defines us." Immigrant parents whispered to their children, "She just spoke for us." Jasmine's voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with resolve. "Courage will always be greater than arrogance. Truth will always be greater than dynasty. And dignity will always belong to those who refuse to be silenced." The words were not just aimed at Barron. They were aimed at every system that told people they weren't enough, at every powerful figure who tried to weaponize privilege, at every young person who doubted they belonged. And in that moment, she wasn't just Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman. She was every voice that had ever been dismissed, every citizen who had ever been told they were less than, every American who knew that identity was not a birthright, but a lived truth. Barron sat frozen, eyes darting, lips pressed tightly shut. No retort came. No comeback could touch the magnitude of what had just been said. The dynasty's heir, so sure of his power at the start of the debate, was left diminished, not by ridicule, but by truth. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply folded her hands, calm and composed, as if to remind everyone that dignity doesn't shout, it stands firm. The studio audience rose to their feet. The applause wasn't frenzied now. It was sustained, solemn, like a standing ovation, not just for a person, but for a principle. Commentators whispered over each other, searching for words to capture the gravity of the moment, because what Jasmine had done went beyond winning an argument. She had reframed the entire debate into something bigger, a lesson about what America is, and what it must never forget. And as the cameras zoomed in one final time, capturing her composed expression, her unwavering presence, her calm power, One truth rang louder than any insult could. She had turned humiliation into inspiration. The lights dimmed slightly as the applause finally began to fade. Jasmine stood, her figure steady under the stage's glow. She gave a slight nod to the audience, then turned, walking away with the same unshakable composure she had carried all night. Barron remained seated, diminished, overshadowed, not by dynasty, but by dignity. And with that, she walked away, leaving not just Barron, but the entire system. Shaken * Trump is not your father. 7 words that landed like thunder. 7 words that didn't just silence a spoiled taunt, they stripped arrogance bare. What Barron thought was a game of dynasty. Jasmine turned into a lesson in dignity. What he meant as insult became his own undoing. In that chamber, with cameras rolling and eyes watching, a single truth stood taller than wealth, taller than name, taller than dynasty itself. Justice belongs to those who earn it, not those who inherit it, and that is why this moment matters. It wasn't just a clapback. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a line in the sand between privilege and principle, between arrogance and accountability, because dynasties rise and fall. But courage leaves echoes. Jasmine didn't just answer Barron. She reminded America and the world that truth can never be bullied into silence. If you believe dignity must always speak louder than dynasty, share this story. If you believe courage must always speak louder than arrogance, let your voice carry it forward. Subscribe for more moments where truth wins and arrogance falls. The final image, Jasmine Crockett, walking out, her steps steady, her presence unshaken. Behind her, Barron sits small, dwarfed not by the size of the chamber, but by the weight of his own arrogance and the world. Still buzzing, still sharing, still remembering, because some words don't fade, they cut through time. And these words, "Trump is not your father," will be remembered as the day dignity took the mic and dynasty fell silent.